So this topic is mobilizing for a low-carbon economy, right? It also could be how do we mobilize people's attention given how many people are in the room, right? It's an interesting challenge that we have, right? When there are shiny things happening next to us, right? How are we going to get people's attention? The people in this room are the people working on this issue, right? You're wrestling with how do we get the data? How do we get the value proposition? What's working? Do we work at the micro scale, the macro scale? And so this is going to be a conversation to figure out how do we get more people involved in working on this? How do we make the arguments that we can be more ambitious than we are now? What are the pressures inside our companies that set us goals at one rate? How do we decide what to do at other rates? That's the challenge before us. This is going to be a discussion. For those of you who haven't been here before, we're going to have a few speakers come up and share some of their work. And then we're going to turn the work over to you and talk about what are we learning, what's practicing, what's happening, what are we wrestling with. The idea of this conversation is to not get up and advertise what you do and say it's wonderful. Everybody is doing wonderful things. And given the membership in this room and the size of this challenge, we know that's not enough. And so try and understand for the people in this room, what are the questions you have? What are you wrestling with? We're going to hear from some amazing companies that have done some work. We know behind that are internal negotiations. Do we set the goal at 25% or 40%? How aggressive can we be? And we want to get into that work. So again, we'll hear from our speakers, then we're going to turn it back. So to do that, I'd love to introduce our first speaker, Robert Metzke, for the Senior Director in Group Strategy from Philips.
Thanks so much. Thanks, yes. Alexander.
My pleasure.
Pleasure being here. Thanks for joining the session. So in 2008, we committed publicly that we wanted to reduce the carbon emissions from Philips globally with 25%. And we actually achieved that, and I think that's why I was invited to share a couple of the insights and the struggles that we had on that journey. It's only 5 minutes, so I will keep it short, but I encourage you to participate in the discussion afterwards. I wanted to share a couple of insights with you around strategic alignment, around creating transparency to build trust and set the right priorities, and around empowering people to get things done, actually, because from the head office you cannot do a lot. You can try to make it relevant to people and get them engaged. So let me just start with the first one. Well, many of you may have seen that picture before, but I think it very nicely shows how densely populated, on one hand, planet Earth is, but on the other hand also how different wealth is distributed at this point in time. If you extrapolate it in your mind, zoom forward to the year 2050, then we will be here with 9 billion people, and we still only have this one planet. And I think this is part of the fundamental challenge that we need to understand if we talk about sustainable development. It is in the essence about decoupling economic growth, social prosperity from ecological footprint. And we had this discussion with our CEO at that time, Gerard Kleisterlee, and later on our new CEO, Frans van Houten, and really tried to make our leadership understand that within a failing society, failing nature, there is no successful business, and that this needs to be a strategic priority, imperative. That is about strategic alignment. Maybe the next thing that I wanted to tap on, sorry, let me stay with this picture for a second, is about creating transparency. In 2008, when we had committed to reduce our CO2 emissions with 25% in absolute terms, regardless of our ambitions to grow the company in 5 years' time, we started with really mapping out the details of our CO2 emissions. That included all production sites, that included logistics, of course, that included all offices, and that included the mobility of our employees globally. We really made detailed heat maps to show where's the biggest impact, what do we need to focus on. We started reporting that also according to the Carbon Disclosure Project, and had really very steep learning curve there now, and have been one of the top companies in the CDP rankings over the last couple of years there. But it really helps to build trust externally and internally, and it helps to set you the right priorities. One of the next things that we did is we tried to link CO2 reduction to business interests. So we used the Vattenfall-McKinsey curve to translate, it's basically a carbon cost curve for those of you that have not seen it, to prioritize where should we start investing in getting CO2 emissions down. That was quite successful actually, and so led to subsequent reductions of 5% year on year over the last years. And as a last step, it is really about empowering people. So also this has two components. One is, of course, trying to support people where they need. For instance, if you have a factory manager that has conflicting KPIs and he has a P&L and needs to make sure that he hits the targets by the end of the year, he cannot afford himself to invest in something with a payback time of 7 years without being punished by the CFO at the same time. So we started to think about a revolving energy investment funds at group level to enable that kind of thing. The other thing is, of course, to align incentives and make sure that cost and benefit of these efforts are ultimately in the same hand. So think about, for instance, logistics and the impact of proper planning. We know that shifting air freight to sea freight can save you a lot of CO2, but for each ton CO2 that you save, it also saves you $400, for instance. On the other hand, if you, for the Christmas business, need to fly in a couple of jumbo jets with supply from China, then you spoil a lot of the effort that colleagues have been doing over the previous months or years. So you need to make sure that the people in charge of these business decisions also feel the pain of it, so that they can make an integral balance. So that were a couple of insights, and there's a lot more to be told about it, but I'm sure you will challenge us in the questions afterwards. Eventually, these measures led to being successful in reducing CO2 emissions with 25% in 5 years' time. And knowing that this can be done, and the trust and the experience that we had, we said, let's move the bar up. We know from life cycle assessments that the impact of our products during the use phase is much bigger than during the production phase. Of course, we are a global leader in supplying professional lighting solutions, to just name something. Another third of the business of Philips is in the area of healthcare and medical equipment, imaging systems, and these kind of things. So we really said, let's move up the bar and extend the scope of our ambition to the entire product portfolio. So with the EcoVision 5 program that we are working on right now, we have said we want to increase the energy efficiency of the entire portfolio of Philips with 50% in 5 years' time. And we have committed 2 billion euros in this program to make this happen. The second pillar of this is material loops. So we really try to understand how to close material loops, and embarked on a partnership of 3 years with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation to work on circular models. And the third element of it is a very important one, is the social impact. So we try to provide access to healthcare to at least 500 million people in the same program, to also show again the balance between social impact and environmental impact. Just in the last minute that remains, I wanted to give you a glimpse behind the curtain on the stuff that we are working on right now. Technological progress is, of course, very important. Solar lighting has been mentioned. The impact of solar lighting is very important, but the breakthrough of LED lighting makes it possible to enable solar lighting. And it also helps you to really drastically reduce energy use. To give you an idea, 1/5 of all electricity globally is currently used to create light. If you would use existing technology, you could take 600 middle-sized power stations off the grid as we speak. What kind of impact would that be? So the technology is available, is in the market, yet it does not take off. So technology is important, but not everything. The second thing, therefore, is to think about new business models that really make this fly. One of the things that we have been working on is introducing light as a service. So not selling the light bulbs anymore, but selling light paperlooks. What you see here is a picture from the office of Thomas Rau, an Amsterdam architect. That was one of the first that we started to engage and develop this business model, paperlooks. And the last thing that I want to mention is what is typical for sustainable solutions really is that we need to incorporate the social and environmental benefits also to make these new business models take off. To give you one example, what I'm talking about here, you see a picture of Mexico City at night. Carbon credits are one way to couple, again, environmental benefits to the economic system. So through carbon credits, we were able to finance 20 million energy-saving light bulbs that have been distributed to the citizens of Mexico City, with a direct impact on purchasing power and environmental benefits. So just to give an idea and trigger the discussion, what it means to think about sustainability as an innovation driver. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Robert. There's obviously so much in what was just said. I mean, the challenge of transparency. How many companies are wrestling with how transparent are we going to be? What's the logic? And how many companies are saying no? Many people in this room are having those conversations, right? Short-termism versus long-termism. What are the economic benefits? How do we make a better model? What are the data arguments? What measurements do we have or not yet have? Again, all content for our conversation coming up. But next, I'd like to introduce Feng An, the president of the Innovation Center for Energy and Transportation. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. So my name is Feng An. I'm from the Innovation Center for Energy and Transportation. We are a policy think tank with office in Los Angeles and Beijing. Our mission is to promote low carbon development and climate change and climate policies and standards in China. The problem in China. So you heard, yesterday, President talked about you cannot breathe in China. So the air. This is the picture shows the air quality in Beijing in the earlier this year. And China now has annually sell 20 million automobiles a year. And in 5 years, that number will go up to 30 million vehicles, which is about twice as much of the United States. So how to control, the rising energy consumption, fossil fuels, air pollution, also to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions are very important. So unless we engage China, and so what we are doing here won't matter that much because China emit 25% of the worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. It's #1 greenhouse gas emitters. And 3 years ago in 2020, we made pledge. So we want to work with our partners and the stakeholders in China to reduce energy consumptions and the pollutions from automobiles. We focus on clean fuels, clean vehicles, and educate consumers and automakers to produce and purchase cleaner vehicles. So specifically, we promise to introduce the world-class fuel economy standards for cars and trucks in China. China didn't have fuel economy standards until 2004. So we help China to develop the first ever fuel economy standards for cars and trucks. So our pledge is to help China to reduce fuel consumption from 9 liters per 100 kilometer in 2000 to 5 liters per 100 kilometer by 2020. So that is a 45% reduction. And we also pledge to help China to develop the sustainable biofuel standards because China, we want to engage, the farmers to produce biofuels, but not to sacrifice the farmlands and to not use green as the feedstock. So we are working with the government in China to make sure their biofuel policies are sustainable. Lastly, we have a consumer education program. We developed green car rating system. We rate over hundreds of vehicle models based on their life cycle emissions. So the challenges, I think, the biggest challenge is resistance from automakers. Also the political fight from different governmental agencies. And the third is the lack of good data. So let's first off, the auto industry has been selected by the government as a pillar industry. So there's agencies in Chinese government to promote the auto industry as a pillar. Then there's the economic development. They want to create jobs. They want to bring in the incomes. Then there's the environmental protection bureau. They want to clean up airs. And then there's national, climate change division. They want to reduce, greenhouse gas emissions. And so there's a lot of conflicting interests. So I think sometimes one group get upper hands. Sometimes the other group, try to fight back. So we have to work through all the web of conflict. So make sure we pick the right partners to work with. The third challenge is the lack of transparency and data source. So in a big developing country like China, it's very difficult to get very good data because data you have to dig out the data. The data is not publicly available. So they are from different sources. So you have to verify those data. You have to collect those data. Sometimes you have to pay and bribe to get those good data. So we're talking about the importance to have good data because you cannot managing if you cannot measure. So that is the key to get data. So that's the challenges we have. And so lessons learned, we learned 3 important lessons. I think one is we call the timing, expert, and partnership, and the financial support. So for timing issues, so you have to choose the right fight, the timing when timing is right, because if you are too ahead of time, so you waste a lot of your resources. So for example, for this vehicle emission standards, we came to China, we tried to, in 2000s. And at that time, the private cars there's very few private cars on the road. So the government agencies, they do not understand, the emissions. They think the biggest emission is dust from unpaved roads. So that changed. So that's too early if you want to engage China about the fuel economy standard. So the timing is right in 2004 when the government started to realize the importance of the implement fuel economy standards. That's how you pick the perfect timing, just the half step ahead of government agencies. So when they are ready to make move, then you have to have expertise. So you know what you are doing. So from my personal experience, I educate in the United States. I work for Department of Energy. I work with EPA. So I know inside out how the fuel economy rule works. So I know the industry, I know the technology, I know the political fight has been going through in the US. So I took that expertise to China and to educate scholars, decision makers. So that is very important. Third is to have a strong partnership. So we bring in the international community, experts from every walk to China, and we take a Chinese delegation to the US to learn about the international experience. And we get support from foundations like Hewlett Foundations, Energy Foundations, and Rockefeller Brothers Fund. So they are very supportive. So those are very important rules. So in conclusion, that the progress has been made in China, but it's not enough. So China still have huge environmental and energy problem. And so what happens in China will have global impacts. So we have to engage China. And number 3 is we need to share experience. So I think China has gained a lot of experience, especially those experiences can be shared to other part of the world, other developing countries as well. So my takeaway is first, I think we need to fight against the development at all costs mentality. I think that's what China has been through. Now China start to change. You can't develop at all costs, and you have to pick up the right fight, timing, expertise, and resources, and partnership. Those are very important. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Again, many sort of content areas for our conversation. Bribing for data, right? How far are we going to go to get data? How far are we going to go to get the data out of private hands that we need to do some of this work, right? The other question that comes up is at scale. What is the scale that we need to be working at 30 million car sales a year, right? And then just we're in the land of competing pressures, right? Whether those pressures are on the economic opportunities that people have or on the small farmer. And so how we get to renegotiate those competing pressures. Again, just want you listening for themes for our conversation in a few minutes. Before that, I'd like to introduce Faith Taylor from Wyndham Worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and good morning. And I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about Wyndham and our journey and give you some examples of the challenges and the opportunities. And I'm going to spend time talking about collaboration, partnerships, because you can't do this without working together. I'm going to talk about innovation, because I believe we do have the solutions today. And at the end of the day, it's about commitment and passion. So when I talk about Wyndham and our Wyndham Green program, which started about 7 years ago when we spun off from Sendat, and I had the opportunity to talk with our CEO because I saw the trends in terms of the lifestyle of health and sustainability. It's a $290 billion market. People are purchasing Prius cars or, Whole Foods. All these things didn't exist 20 years ago, but today it is reality. And when we looked at our program, and I said, you know what, this is going to be strategic, which it is today. It's one of our top 5 strategic priorities. But we made a commitment to reduce our carbon emissions by 20% by 2020 and 16% by 2016. And we have actually achieved 12% year-to-date globally. And that's part of our Clinton Global Initiative, but it's also in partnership with the Obama Department of Energy Better Buildings Challenge. So when I talk about the program, how did we go about achieving this year to date? First, we're a global company, and most people think of Wyndham of just being hotels. We have over 7,000 hotels, but we also have 190 timeshare units, and we have 100,000 rental exchanges. So it's a pretty big footprint. And we're in 100 countries, and we have over 40 brands. And what was the challenge? How do we get to our carbon footprint within that short period of time to make the commitment that we did? And so what we did was we used technology. We learned that in Europe, and Europe has been doing this much longer than the United States, that technology or software, there exists software today. And so we actually partner with a company to develop a software solution to capture our carbon footprint globally. And that's what we did within a short period of time. And that software actually enabled us to it's in over 20 currencies. It actually is in different languages, and it gave us a common metrics as well as solutions. And that was a big enabler, and technology continues to be an enabler in terms of this space. The other challenge was within the timeshare industry. That's a different model, and most people weren't sure about how do you actually solve for going green in that industry. So within our timeshare division, they developed a certification program. Why? Because we understand certifications, whether it's the greenhouse, whether it's the Energy Star certification or things that consumers get. And it was easy for us to explain to the timeshare owners what we were doing. But that platform actually enabled us to, with a certification 4-tiered solution, enabled us to come up with a system and guidelines. And that has actually enabled us to reduce their footprint in that portfolio over 14% globally for them. So that was a way for us to actually achieve a program, and they're a big component of our overall footprint and actually helped us deliver the savings that we have today. Another challenge was around biodiversity, and we know that almost half of the forest around the globe is impacted negatively in terms of what's happening, deforestation. So within our timeshare group, we worked with the Arbor Day Foundation. And we said, what can we do? And through our purchasing power, we were able to develop a Arbor Day coffee program that's grown in the shade. And this program, because it's grown in the shade and is actually done in the country of Peru, we actually sell the Arbor Day coffee in our timeshare units. And so over 250,000 pounds of shade-grown coffee is what we actually are consuming annually. That translates to saving over 26 million square footage of trees. Now, what most people don't know is that naturally, coffee is grown in shade. But over the years, with the major companies and coffee being consumption going up exponentially, they actually tear down the trees and they grow it, in not its natural state. The social benefits that are very important here, though, through the program is that the families who harvest it, we pay women and men equally. The children, we provide education as well as hospital care. And because we pay them more for the program, that's enabled us to have a social benefit as well as environmental benefit. Another key area is in terms of my hotel division. So we have a franchise model. And in a franchise model, how do we actually get them to participate in the program? What we have is a Green Advisory Board, and this Green Advisory Board is a peer-to-peer group. And the peer-to-peer group, we actually use hotel owners as examples of how you can go green, and we have over 24 brands that participate in this. One is a Super 8 Ukiah. He's an economy brand, and he actually has installed an electric car station within Ukiah. He's one of the first ones. Well, he's been able, and he's also greened his entire hotel where he's reduced his operating expenses by 15%. But more importantly, he's increased his marketing revenues because he's on Facebook, uses social media by 25%. Now, Ramada Vineland in New Jersey, he actually installed a solar farm. And the business model is all about driving heads and beds in terms of the hotel industry. But he's reduced his electricity consumption by 80%, and he's shooting for going cost neutral. So that's a different business model than what he has today. And that actually starts to show our other owners that this can be done in a profitable way. Lastly, I'm really proud about a group of 23 hotels that have partnered with NGOs called the World Travel and Tourism Council and International Tourism Partnership. We had to develop carbon measurement initiative across to be able to actually compare hotels. And the biggest challenge was, how do you compare an economy hotel with a full service hotel in terms of what your carbon emissions are? So what we did was we actually got together and we had to partner and collaborate and actually develop metrics so that someone staying in a hotel understood what your carbon footprint was according to the different product types. The last, in terms of wrapping this all up, I know I quickly gave you all these different examples, is that in my mind, there are 3 key areas in terms of how you can continue to go green or develop sustainable practices globally. First is collaboration, and I talk a lot about partnerships, whether it's partnerships internally or externally with organizations to come up with solutions. Innovation, to me, at the end of the day, sustainability, you cannot do sustainability without innovation, whether it's technology, new programs, developing new products. It can be done. We have the solution today. And last is passion. And you know, we talk about people, planet, and profits, but to me, the 4th tier, the 4th leg is all about passion. And individuals, I found in my organization, I'm very humble, to organizations, 2 countries can work together to make this happen. And the commitment happens with one person saying you can make a change. So that's it for me, and thank you very much.
Great. So, great kickoff into our conversation, right? And challenging, right? Because one of the things that we can do in this conversation is celebrate progress. And we want to hear from all of you about what progress is being made. And then we want to understand whether we're being ambitious enough. Right? There's a lot of attention that came out around the Carbon Disclosure Project and the Worldwide Fund saying there's a 3% solution, right? That we can get $780 billion back in revenue from 3%. And many of us believe this is a multi-trillion-dollar lack of investment in this sector, right? That it's going to take to get to where we want to go. So what's it going to take? What are you learning in the last few months around what it's going to take to get to scale to bring this the kind of progress that we need and we're passionate about, right? What are you finding? This is the audience participation part of our program. Bracken, yes, please.
Sure. I was just really excited by Wyndham's example and hearing about the discussion about a business model challenge and how you empower people to actually change the way they're thinking about generating profit or accounting for costs. I mean, it's actually how we are accounting for value and measuring how we create value. I mean, it was implicit in all of the discussions. Yeah. But I'd love to hear from folks not only what's working, but where they're running into barriers that are that involve structures in the business model itself and where they're seeing exciting opportunities for new options.
Does anybody want to respond to Bracken's question? What's an example where we're trying to bring new thinking, new ways of calculating, but the old model is sort of bumping up against that? Who is an example of that? Yeah. The microphone's coming to you.
Just give a quick example of how Microsoft is approaching this challenge, and what they've done is they've created a global carbon fee. I'm Amy Christensen. I've been an energy and environmental consulting and investment firm, and I worked with Microsoft in launching their carbon strategy last year. And they've put a global carbon fee across their operations. So all the countries in which they operate have to pay into a central fund based upon the level of their emissions. So it's all calculated. They pay into the fund, and so that way it decentralizes the incentive to reduce emissions out to those countries. So it's not some central sustainability team, but it's been decentralized. And then they can apply to that fund to co-invest in emission reduction projects in their markets to reduce their liability and their future payments.
And how do they figure out what the fee should be, right? Because that's a delicate art, right? How do you set the fee so that it's not changing everybody, but it's not so marginal that it doesn't have an impact? How do they calculate that?
That's an ongoing challenge, and they actually haven't published yet publicly the price. And they've been working on that, and it's only been a year and 3 months. Right. And so the next stage that they want to get to is to share with others, okay, this is how it's working, this is how it isn't. And so I would love for that for next year to have some conversations about these different models, because that's just one, and I know companies are taking different approaches to this. I think the critical message, though, is how do we get to the scale that science requires? And I think that's what we have to all ask ourselves. It's great to go 20%, 25%, but how are we getting to those longer term? And obviously at 25%, you're on the way to those numbers, but how quickly can we do
I mean, it's a great little case study of Bracken's question where it's bumping up. Is it 2% or is it 40%? Is a significant difference. And bumping up against the transparency piece that we'd heard from our first speaker, Robert. Other examples? Yes, you had one.
One of the things that we've seen, my name is Eyal Aronoff and I'm with the Fuel Freedom Foundation. One of the things that we have seen is there's really no price for carbon. Every type of carbon has different price. So for example, in the United States, last year we burned $35 billion worth of coal, but $780 billion worth of petroleum products. The carbon is not the same and the price is not the same. If you're trying to replace coal, it's a very difficult task because it's very cheap.
Yeah.
You know, instead, we are not spending enough of our effort to try replacing oil, although it's very expensive. It should be easier to replace.
And what's working in helping people figure out how to bring those two units together, right? There's a lot of invested in them being separate and siloed, right? Anybody? Yes, please.
Well, first of all, I'm Paula DePerna from CDP, and I appreciate the references to the work that CDP has done. There is a price on carbon, and I think it's both real and also conceptual. I mean, everyone in this room has been doing, if we added up the time people in this room have been spending on this issue, we're probably into several centuries among us all. And, you know, one does have to say that there is a price on carbon, even if it's not legislative. And anybody using fuel hedges fuel price. And we never conceptualize the link between a hedge on a fuel price and a price on carbon. Everyone is planning for increase in price of fuel. And even that's a price on carbon. So from what we've seen, and to your point about the 3% solution, if you lined up the reductions with the scientific requirement to hold it at 2 degrees, it's 3% net present value positive. Now, you either believe that or you don't. If you believe it, there's a business reason why it's not, that's money on the table.
Yeah.
And what is the reason companies are not going after money on the table? This is what I don't understand. Either the money's not on the table, the methodology is not right, or it's too good to be true. But, you know...
So what are you finding? I mean, I think that's a really interesting...
Well, I think what we're finding is that the companies are still siloed with regard to this, and there's a disbelief. It's too good to be true. How can it be true? If it was true, we'd have gone after the money. Yeah. Then somebody says, okay, Microsoft's got a carbon fee. Well, they make a guess at what it is. It's under $20. Well, how can it be worth it if it's under $20? Except they're not thinking about the hedge on the fuel price, which is way above that. So we need a price on carbon czar. Is what we need. And somebody who can harmonize all the discussions about, quote, the price on carbon, because there is, I mean, when carbon markets were in their heyday in Europe and carbon was trading at 30 euros a ton, at that time, that was larger than the corn, soybean, and wheat markets in the United States. Now we're down to under $1. Reggie's is at $2. Microsoft, we don't know. Exxon is estimating $60 a ton. So people are talking about price on carbon, and so I would say we have to give a lie to the fact that there's no price on carbon and look for surrogate prices. And there are plenty of surrogate prices.
Great. Other comments? Do you want to say something? Yeah.
So I'm Mitra Arjun from Lumita Networks, and I'm interested in how we can or should leapfrog some of the mistakes we've made here as we move to emerging markets, right? I mean, we've all seen that in the cell phone industry. And if we take, take, for example, that image that Robert was using from Philips of light in the north, right? That's actually an image of energy waste. Right. It's because we're lighting the sky, not lighting the task. If we look at the image from China of that pollution, that's because we're taking the worst from the West as we develop the South and as we develop China, not taking the best. Yeah. So how do we move ahead? I mean, we make prepaid electricity meters to enable people to serve the bottom billion. And if we made them to Western standards, they'd be unaffordable in the South. So it's like, how do we change our thinking as we mobilize, as we develop the South, so we do it in a low carbon way and we don't try and impose ideas from the North which are going to lead to the wrong solutions?
So how are you doing it, right? So what's the challenge to your business model that you're running into in trying to do this for the bottom?
Well, what we do is we develop very low-cost meters. Now, anyone
Yeah.
here in the metering business will tell you they're probably spending $200 to $300 a meter.
Right.
Well, the average family in a developing country spends $50 a year on energy. So it's going to take you 4 years to pay off the cost of the meter. We set a goal of hitting a $15 meter that would enable energy companies to serve poor people with solar energy so they could get off of kerosene. Because that market is predominantly burning kerosene for light, which is about as carbon inefficient as you want. Not just carbon, it's black soot as well, which is a major impact. So it's how do you address those bottom billion, and you don't do it with solutions that they can't afford. Affordability is the key to addressing that market.
Right. So we know there are lessons learned, right, of not taking the Western model to the rest of the world, right? And the last comment, we know that there are good metrics out there, and there are complicated shared metrics, right? And as you said, Paul, some people have been working on this for a few decades. Some of us are going gray or losing our hair doing this, right? And so what else is learning? What are we learning about how to make this argument, and how do we upset business models to do something different? What other examples, right? You're wrestling with this, some of you, every day. Yeah, Mindy.
Well, we've seen some small examples, but we need to do more about, as companies engage in sustainability and addressing carbon, bringing footprint down, investing in renewables, we need to show the economics of that. So not only talk about how it's a good thing, it works, we need to show the profit and loss, we need to show the return on investment of those kind of investments. We keep hearing in hundreds of rooms we're in,
what do you keep hearing?
Sustainability is a long-term thing. We're evaluated on our short-term returns as a company. All of this costs money in the short term. We can't afford to do it. Now I would say the large companies are not saying that. They're investing in sustainability. But as you get to a slightly broader group. So I think we need to do a better job of showing return on investment and what it means and why it is very clear.
Yeah. And why are we having a hard time doing that? Why are we having a hard time making that argument?
Well, the short-term, long-term argument is legitimate. It's also negative and pervasive, but you can't show the value of investing in changing the energy lighting systems or the monitoring systems in 100 hotels or 500 apartment buildings. You can't show the return on investment over the next 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, or 12 months. You can show it often over 2.5 years. So part of it is not only showing it, but changing the debate that not every investment needs to have a return over the next quarter or the next 6 months. I mean, in a Deutsche Bank study last year, it showed that the cost of capital for investing to companies that are leaders on integrating environmental, social, and governance issues is much cheaper. That there is a return on the investment. But we've got to change the debate a bit from you've got to prove it over the shortest possible term.
Yeah. Both of you have been engaged in this debate inside your companies, right? And so we know that your companies are doing wonderful things, you've made progress, but we know behind that is a whole bunch of internal debate about how do you change the argument, what's the timeline. So either of you, how'd you do it?
Very briefly, sorry, let me use that. Briefly replying to that one, I think it's a very fair question on how do you judge return on investment. It's not only financial investment. So how we get the mindset to say towards value creation. I think there was this famous article from Michael Porter in the HBR. I think it's 2 years ago by now. And you see that not only companies but also governments think about non-financial KPIs in terms of measuring social well-being. So which politicians dare to stand up and say, well, I'm not working on increasing GDP as a vote for the next election, but I'm working on your personal health and well-being, for instance, which is a completely different discussion in times of economic crisis also, and might help to break that.
So, again, I just want to get a little out of the abstract. How do you do it, right? How do you do it in your company? Right?
So I just want to be with a concrete example, right? So it's short-term is all about net operating income and versus return on investment, right? So that's cash flow to the company, and that is every quarter you have to hit your numbers. So when you look at sustainability and you evaluate projects, we do analysis around the immediate cash flow impact around net operating income with projects that can give you that short-term payback as you also are investing for long-term projects that might take 2, 5, 7 years. So it's a balancing act, and the types of initiatives that you'd have for what I call more of a short-term investment versus those that you're doing long-term, it is a balance in the mix and the projects that you're doing. But absolutely, in my mind, you have to link it to the financials of just running that asset. I'm talking more from a corporate real estate perspective.
Sure.
And then you start to free up and get the longer term thinking. So getting those short term wins immediately, working with the portfolio. And I would argue that we have not exhausted all those simple wins yet. You know, we're still on this journey. I found when I go out and talk to, you know, consumers and owners and developers, we haven't done a lot of the basics, you know, consistently across a lot of these assets across the world. So to me, there's a huge opportunity to just look at it from a pure financial basis, and that's what, you know, Wall Street's looking at, and tie it to that, and then also balance it with that long term.
And I love these last two comments, right? One is you have to look at it from a pure financial basis, and the comment before was you can't just look at it from a pure financial basis. It has to be another value model. We have a comment in the back. How are we going to reconcile this? Yeah.
Hello, I'm Greg Barker. I'm the UK Minister for Energy and Climate Change.
So you're thinking about this topic?
Thinking about it, yeah.
What are you doing on it?
Well, on a direct basis, when we came into office, when David Cameron took charge in 2010, we had a pledge to reduce our own emissions in government buildings by 10% in 1 year. I took charge of that. Everyone said you couldn't do it. In actual fact, it's easier in old, decrepit buildings in many extents. We actually reduced by 13% in 2010-11 and have committed to reduce by 25% by 2015. So I'm just looking around the room. It can be done with relatively simple measures. I'm also in charge of national policy, trying to encourage business, and have looked at a range of things. We didn't start doing this. The previous government, starting under Tony Blair, had put in a range of drivers, and it was very interesting to do a stocktake of what worked, what didn't. One of the biggest reasons that so many companies don't take this seriously, don't make sensible financial investments, particularly on energy efficiency, is it's just not a big bit of their overall revenue. If you exclude manufacturing, which in the UK economy is less than 20% of the economy, and of a section of that energy-intensive business, if you exclude that, for the typical company, the cost of energy is somewhere around 5% of sales. You know, if you're a retailer, if you're a...
So what are you finding to help them care? Right?
So
how do you get them to care about this?
Actually, you'd have to have a really clobbering financial incentive or penalty in order to get them to take a decision.
That's a great political move.
Yeah, exactly. What we found more effective was reputational drivers, particularly for larger companies. So we had something called the carbon reduction commitment, and the league table, which basically set out the companies and what they were achieving. That took the 2,000 or so largest energy users and broke them down and ranked them. That really got the attention of the board because it also got the attention of their shareholders. Right. So you need reputational drivers as well. And then for smaller companies, it's finance. And we've introduced a pay-through-the-bill model of financing for both consumers and for businesses, whereby they can capture the savings, and particularly for firms where they don't own the premises, but the premises are owned by an institution or a property company. Yeah. It cuts through that Gordian knot of, well, why would the landlord invest in retrofitting the building if all the savings are going to go to the tenant on their electricity bill?
Right. And I'm still want to press this question of how ambitious can we be, right? Because it's a political calculation of whether we're going to say a 10% reduction that we know how to do, or a 60% reduction that we don't yet know how to do. Bracken, you want to jump in?
Sure. And excuse me, Bracken Hendricks with Center for American Progress. I want to go to something you were saying a little bit earlier, which is about getting specific.
Please.
I think that it's really important to understand the specific decisions people are making in terms of making investment decisions, because these are problems that have been solved before, sort of large public goods issues, underinvestment in things that are publicly beneficial, and there are solutions that have made it possible to invest. For example, the notion that energy savings are so small that they're never going to be a major part of your budget. If you look at affordable housing or community reinvestment, there are other places where there have been very substantial but very diffuse types of benefit, and the market wasn't kind of on its own doing it, so a policy intervention was made just for that. So now you create the affordable housing tax credit. And so, well, maybe it's not profitable for major real estate developers to just charge in on their own, but you build an industry of nonprofit housing associations and so forth, and suddenly there's a multi-billion-dollar industry that Citibank is now taking a look at. And so figuring out particular solutions that change the calculation, I think, are very important, because we can't really ask businesses to make uneconomic decisions, but what we can do is build sort of new intermediary industries that are focused on making these things more economically attractive. And I think finance is especially important. If you can get over, that's another economic decision. The challenge is not really, is this profitable? Is there a real return on investment here? The challenge is, it's competing against other uses of my capital. So as a company whose job is to make drugs or to, build sporting equipment or whatever, it's not my business. It's much more profitable for me to invest in a new business line than it is to cut some costs modestly across production. But if you can avoid the capital costs, if you can make it very easy, overcoming those very specific barriers to particular decisions, I think, are critical.
Right. Yes, coming up in front. The hard work of making it easy.
Leah Seligman from NRG Energy. And one of the challenges, among other things, we are the largest developer of solar in the U.S. And one of the challenges that we face is that there are strategic decisions happening at the top in sustainability offices and CEOs' offices around energy, but the actual purchasing decision is happening in procurement, and those guys are judged based on how much they return to the bottom line. And so how do you actually keep that strategic level when you get down to the purchasing decision versus setting the goals?
Right. And how are you finding, you're experimenting? How are you trying to tackle that one? Because
we're experimenting a lot, actually, and it often comes down to where do you enter the organization. And so we just started a partnership with a hotel chain, and one of the ways that they were able to justify the investment in solar is because it will be a revenue generator, because more people will book green meetings there. But the procurement person would never have thought about people who are interested in green coming and booking in that meeting and driving revenue in their conference center. So it's definitely where you end up, but also the organizations need to be aware that you often push down those decisions further and further into your organization to the point that there's no chance of getting a strategic decision.
Right. Are there specific examples where people are wrestling with some of this? Yes.
Very short add-on to that. So you have spreadsheet sales where something makes sense. I was thinking of an electric truck company that's now selling to FedEx and Coca-Cola and others, and the truck purchases are much higher up front, but the payback is 3 to 4 years, and that's at least a 10-year purchase. So it sells itself on the spreadsheet, but the challenge is within the organization getting that authorization to do the upfront capital increase. And so then what we've been doing is connecting, of course, the broader sustainability strategists up at the top of the company who understand the broader benefits for the company, the branding and other benefits, as well as all across the company, the other benefits that come with this. So just a specific example of how you have to connect that, because the fleet guys don't have the authorization to spend 25% more up front.
Yep, coming over here. Mike's coming to you.
Thanks. Nick Parker, Global Acceleration Partners. And what I'm really focused on is taking clean tech companies to China. So 2 quick observations around the questions you're trying to pose. One is we see China as a problem in the West, and I see China as a source of most of the solutions that we're going to be buying and so on. And I think there's an integrated way of thinking. I think part of the challenge is just the very label of the conversation, the low carbon economy. Reduction versus growth is generally psychologically not where you get people's attention. We like to go up the curve, not down the curve. Yeah. Secondly, people have multiple problems to solve: water, food, urbanization. And so prioritizing this over other things is a problem. So my key point is people want solutions to sustainability, not solutions to low carbon. And if you can wrap this into a broader package of things, then you get attention of a broader range of stakeholders, policymakers, economic decision makers, and so on.
Yeah.
So I think that's.
So how do you do that? I mean, it's nice to be optimistic and look at all the beautiful language, right?
Well,
so how are you finding what language is working? How are you holding people's attention to this?
First of all, I call it next tech, not clean tech now, and I was the person who coined the term clean tech, so I'm allowed to say that. And next tech is the nexus of integrated solutions. So let's say you have a problem with food waste, you have a problem with generating clean energy, and you have a problem with soil depletion. Well, there are companies, including ones here, who bring a suite of solutions to the table, which also generate local employment, et cetera, et cetera. That's an example. Or the reality of coal-fired plants, let's say in China. They're not going to go away in the near term, although the Chinese have just said they're going to cut back on coal. But if you can take the fly ash and use that to make, let's say, cement, then you can reduce the carbon footprint of cement making dramatically and improve the energy efficiency of that. So indirectly, you get to the low carbon solution.
Right. So it's a provocative idea that the problem with this issue is between our ears, right? It's the problem of how we're thinking about it or talking about it. So what are the other limitations of how we're thinking about it that's getting in our own way? Yeah, comment over here in the back.
It's nice to hear talking about cement. I'm with Lafarge, one of the world leaders of cement production. We're big generators of CO2 in the planet as an industry. And just if I take Lafarge as an example, we've taken a big commitment to reduce CO2 production per ton. But what's interesting is there's all kinds of barriers against us and headwinds going against us that really...
What's an example?
I'll give you 3 examples. One of the big levers we have is alternative fuels. Get that circular economy going. In a cement kiln, you can burn damn near anything and replace it for, instead of putting coal in there, you could put anything you could imagine that's got a combustible value. But the permitting and the around that, there's massive breaks about being able to do that. It takes a huge amount of time. So if I look at one of the measures we have is what's our percentage of alternative fuels that we use against coal. It's one of the most important criteria, and we have very slow progress, not because we don't want to do it, just because there's massive breaks around us and there's inability to find good streams of waste to burn. The second is the ability to reinvest. You got to build modern plants. Technology in cement plants has massively improved in the last 30 years, and plants today generate a fraction of CO2 what they did previously. But the problem is all countries don't have the same CO2 regulations, so it's very difficult to put capital in the ground in a lot of countries when you're competing against other plants that aren't playing by the same rules. Right. And that's another thing where government policy
can have an important... So how do you make those decisions? And as a company, how do you make decisions about how much to invest in changing the brakes, right? How these roadblocks, right? It's a significant set of questions of policy. How active are you going to get? I mean,
you need to work closely with government regulators and help them really understand where the drivers and the levers are to help them push in the right direction.
Yes, come. Mike's coming.
Yeah, we recently have a program from the U.S. Department of Commerce to work with the Chinese government to establish the U.S.-China Clean Tech Center with our first showcase in the city of Tianjin. So we're actually in the process to bring the small to medium-sized U.S. company to China. Now, I think for the, I think there's nothing wrong with the terminologies, like low carbon, clean tech. I think China gets it, because China has such a severe constraints on resources and air pollution problem. So it's just how to measure them. What do you mean by low carbon? Whether you have a measurable, metrics to measure the progress. So I think in terms of a government determination, I think China may have most aggressive, targets like carbon intensity reduction targets, 40% in the next 10 years. So those are very aggressive, but I think that China is repeating the mistake, being made by countries like U.S. Even though, I think my message is that, I think the developed countries, especially the United States, still need to take lead, because all the countries like China, India, they are going to follow the path. So we have been in China in the past 10 years, try to turn away the tide, try to tell them do not repeat the mistake. But I think sometimes it's difficult. But there's some good technology like a cell phone, and the internet that really works, spread out in China. So now we need energy revolution. We need to fund. I think still, we're all in it together, and the U.S., China, and Europe. They need to find a way to solve the energy problem. I don't think we have the perfect solution to solve the energy. That's why,
Yeah, but that's why we're trying to understand what are the mistakes we're making. We're going to come in here and then we'll come in back. But what are the mistakes we're making? Where are we tripping ourselves up? Whether it's language, right? Come in here, we'll come back, then we'll come back to this side.
Thank you very much. I'm Julia Gillard. I was Prime Minister of Australia, and I just wanted to respond to a number of things in the conversation. It has been really energising to hear all of the things that people are doing within their own businesses to make a difference. But to broaden the thinking, to respond to your the limitations between our ears, what are we thinking about, and to respond to your comment too about working on this across nations. Ultimately, the incentives need to be not only what you are prepared to do internally within your own business, but what we are prepared to do as nation states working together to reduce carbon. And I think it's unarguable that the most efficient way of reducing carbon is to price it across economies so that you drive different choices about energy generation and reward those who are generating energy for us with less carbon intensity. In Australia, we did that. We priced carbon. It's been an incredibly politically vexed debate, and the truth is the carbon price may not stay as a result of the recent change in government. But looking at what is an incredibly energy-intensive, carbon-intensive economy per capita, we vie with Americans for being the most carbon-intensive people on the planet. That's because the history of our industrialisation is a history of cheap coal. What we needed to do was to put a price on carbon. Basically, that captured the 500 biggest carbon pollution generators in our nation. They are responsible, rational business people, just like everybody in this room. And if something that they used to do for free, they now have to pay a price for, they work out pretty quickly how to pay less of a price because they do less carbon pollution. And you already, even though the price on carbon pollution is not an old price, you already are seeing a response in the energy market because you've changed the economics between coal-fired power generation and renewable power generation, the economics between coal and gas. So that, I think, ultimately is where we are going to need to get to, and it's really about not only all of these individual efforts which are so valuable, but what people can do to change the nature of the community conversation that enables the bigger picture, longer term solutions to be enacted across nations. Interestingly, China, of course, is piloting in some provinces emissions trading schemes. That is, I think, a very good development and something to be applauded. Yes, we've seen volatility in carbon markets in Europe, but that doesn't mean that the model doesn't work. We've seen volatility in all markets in Europe as a result of the global financial crisis. So we shouldn't let the global financial crisis and carbon price volatility deter us from that long-term solution.
Great, thank you. Coming in back here.
Thank you. Bob Goff, Intertribal Council on Utility Policy. Large scale possibility and then a very specific example. We're looking to for sponsors for a prize to our nation's law students to come up with the paper on legalizing sustainability. It's outlawed by regulation in so many places. Many of the technologies that can be applied in the third world can't be applied in the U.S. Gray water, as an example, the use of it and the technologies around that. So looking to find ways of cutting through and having an army of law students attack the regulatory problems may be one opportunity we have. Very specific, we announced at the CGI in Chicago in June, 1,000 megawatt pledge by 6 tribes in South Dakota. The idea is the grid is finite. Only so much power can be moved on it, and if we can put clean energy on, something comes off, and that's coal. It needs the same farm-to-market highway. So we're strategically looking at the assets we have and the opportunities we have to make a difference.
Great, thank you. So what other armies do we need to deploy besides law students? Yeah.
My name is Jochen Wermuth, a family office from Germany. We've launched a fund called the Green Gateway Fund, among others inspired by the man here. We take what we think is best-in-class technology from Germany, Europe, companies, and help them to go to Russia and China and other places where we get a big impact. The Russians consume 4 times more than the Germans, so even ahead of the Australians and the Canadians, I think. I'm not so sure, though. Yeah. Congratulations, by the way, what you've done in Australia. That's wonderful. What I would like to get your support on is we are very close in Germany to get to 100% renewable. We could be 100% renewable by 2020. There's very concrete plans now. You can power down your wind farms that exist already, don't have to go offshore, and get 70% base load just from renewable wind, 30% from solar, and have biogas storage and be 100% there. And our dear Chancellor Merkel has gotten a bit nervous recently because of the coal and gas guys losing their jobs. So we're looking for support to get her, hopefully with a green partner, to move forward. I have a question, by the way, with regard to Australia. Any chance of the G20 upholding the Australian idea to move forward on carbon tax? Very tough. I had a mentor, Garrett Fitzgerald, the Prime Minister of Ireland, and he pushed through the cutting of the deficit of Ireland. But before he did it, he agreed with his likely successor that he'd keep it. So next time around when you're in power, agree with your successor that'll keep the carbon tax. Yep. Thank you.
Coming up here, right in front of you. Just.
Yeah. I'm a professor of Tsinghua University. I'm interested for the recycling of batteries. So may I draw attention to the automobiles? Because we have a picture Mr. Feng provided us. You see in Beijing many cars and the traffic jam and air pollution, a lot of problem for that. If you have the pictures maybe 20 or 30 years ago, you will find many is bicycles. But now it's as well as automobiles, but also we have many battery-powered bicycles used in Beijing and the city area. So I think for the we cannot stop use cars. We cannot stop use bicycles, but we need to use a much green way to transport us from one place to another place. So Chinese use bicycles powered by batteries, and also now is also have pellet for the automobiles powered by batteries. In some cities have pilot program. If you visit Beijing, you will find that in one of the county of Beijing, Yanqing, you can take a taxi of battery-powered taxi. Yeah. And in Shenzhen, you can also have similar experience. So Chinese government have very exciting planning, official planning for this. Maybe 2020 will be millions of battery-powered cars will be on the road. So yeah. Maybe this is a big market and also can achieve the low carbon society.
Right, which is also a big ingredient in this, so we haven't spent as much time talking about how do you change consumer behavior, right? And how much of our energy should be spent on corporate behavior and corporate decision-making versus consumer behavior. We'll have a comment here. You've been waiting to say something.
This may be more of a question. Actually, I have a comment too about your low carbon. The tax, I completely agree with you that nothing would be more effective than having a carbon tax. I think the problem is that people think of it as a tax, and why do we want to burden ourselves with something?
We got our naming team over here that can start to help with that.
We need a name, but I also think what we need to do is connect it to the cost of climate change, because the cost of climate change, I mean, climate-related disasters, and FEMA spends $100 billion a year. You know, we're going to start losing hundreds of billions of dollars, not trillions of dollars of real estate because of sea level rise and climate change, so that if this is seen as a revenue source to pay for the expenses that are incurred because of climate change and make that connection between the cost of climate change and not just that this is a tax that the do-gooders are punishing us for, but that this is what we're going to use to fund what is coming or what we're currently already experiencing. I also had a comment about somebody was talking about basically the different silos within corporations and how one team doesn't think about energy efficiency because that's not their procurement versus the other people in the corporation. I have a medical supply manufacturing company, so we do a lot of business with hospitals, and had retrofitted our own company to be more energy efficient and had a discussion about how do hospitals, why don't we get every hospital in the country to do this? And I think that there's two barriers, whether it's hospital or any other industry. One is upfront capital, which will be returned in a payback, but you need the upfront capital. And two is expertise. And they don't, they think about treating patients. They don't have the expertise on renewable energy. So just to the extent, and I think this is happening a little bit, but this is really a question for the people in the room. How do we get third parties, whether it be banks or consulting firms, are just more involved to say, hey, I can provide you the capital up front. You can pay me back with the savings that I can quantify, and I know what's going to be coming over the next 10 to 20 years. And here's the expertise I can come in and consult for you. So I don't know what's happening, or if somebody has some specifics on that.
Mindy, this is what you spend a lot of time doing. How's this argument going? Is the calculation there? What do we need?
Well, as we were saying, the calculation is there, not necessarily over 6 months. In Massachusetts, I would say, and we try and look out clearly across the country, less overseas, the hospitals are doing a lot. So if you look at the partner system, if you look at Boston Medical Center, they are all making very clear commitments on reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, changing some of their energy sources. They're putting the capital in. A lot of it is self-financed, but not all self-financed. And there are some good models, and I could get you the names of the people that we've worked with who are doing it and making a real difference. We find, and I'm from Ceres, and we work with about 90 large companies and investors on integrating climate and sustainability, that the number of consultants doing technical consulting as well as general from now every one of the large accounting firms, the McKinseys and down, who are not at the same price points. There's an enormous amount of consultancies doing work.
No.
Right.
Where does the funding piece fit in, Mindy?
So that's a good question. The programs that we've seen in Boston, particularly at the hospitals, have largely been self-financed. They've basically made the calculation that putting capital into these programs has a quick enough payback that it was a very smart thing to do, including Gary Gottlieb now, who is the president of Partners and obviously manages many of the leading hospitals in Boston, making that a key part of what he talks about. So I think of the examples that we're seeing and working with, they're inside financing, more so than outside finance.
I mean, you work with about 90 companies. Why don't you work with 180 companies? What's the roadblocks to getting the scale that we're talking about?
So I would say the following. The issue, somebody I think is probably one of the leading corporate spokespeople on this issue, Paul Pullman. I was at a dinner last night and he asked that question. I think there are many, many companies. I think there are more and more companies coming into this space. The 90 that we work with are on a very deep dive from how to integrate sustainability at the board level, tie it to compensation, change products and facilities and employee programs all the way through to the supply chain. That said, we just benchmarked 600 of the Russell 1000. There are far more companies now reducing their footprint, doing different things. I think the real jump that we need to see is scale and depth. I think we're seeing more breadth. And we will, over the next 2 years, see 500 companies supporting policy and 500 companies reducing their carbon footprint, different anecdotal special initiatives. Yeah. I think the key is how you integrate this into the real breadth of what a corporation does all the way through. So it's part of the governance, it's part of the integration. And I will say the final point, if we don't change the conversation from this is a tree hugger issue to a kill the economy issue. Yeah. This is none of that. It is about the future of national security, public health, the environment, and the economy. And if we're trying to change 150 political leaders, let's say in the United States, who are middle of the road, they need to hear from businesses and hospital CEOs and saying, addressing this is about the future of our economy. We've got to take this out of, tree huggers like it, or the environmentalists, but let's all agree it's a job killer. It is not a job killer. The risk is real, and the economics are real, and we can show it.
And that's I think that's what we're trying to contend with. How do we get it to accelerate at that scale, right?
Exactly.
And it's, as Bracken was saying before, some of that comes to very specific arguments to specific people in procurement that have to show models, right? Because one of the things we know is that we don't want companies just to do what they're currently comfortable with, right? Whether it's the political act or the economic or the financial act, of how do we actually accelerate what they're comfortable with or passionate about to do something slightly uncomfortable so that it then becomes comfortable so we can take that next step.
And that's exactly correct.
Right.
I think...
We have a comment over here we're going to get to, yeah.
I think there's an enormous amount going on in the private sector, but we ought not to fool ourselves. Having a regulatory or statutory framework that says we shall do this, whether it's a price on carbon, that creates a level playing field, so everybody's playing by the same rules. We're going to have to get there. I don't have delusions that we're going to get there next Wednesday in the United States Congress, but we have to look at that, and I think the leadership of people here need to be thinking with us about not only how do we change our own footprint, but how do we boldly stand up despite pushback.
Let's take that for our last few minutes, really. What are the things that's going to accelerate that political argument or that courage to do some of that? You've been waiting to say. Yeah.
Okay, I have to say something. I'm listening to what you guys are saying, and the topic here was mobilizing low carbon economy. To mobilize economy, it's about very, very large scale. It's so it's great that we save 10% here and 15% there and 40% over here. But if you look globally in the total numbers, okay, so the global cost of electricity is roughly $800 billion. The global cost of liquid fuels is $3.3 trillion today. Okay, if you reduce 10%, 20%, 30% of global electricity demand, you only save $200-300 billion worth of product. If you reduce, on the other hand, 20-30% of liquid carbons, okay, gasoline and so on, there's a gigantic business opportunity there. And it seems that, like, yes, we've heard for FedEx and UPS, fantastic leadership. What Feng is doing in China, it's admirable. It's fantastic leadership. But a lot of the discussion here about building and all that stuff, it's all good, but it's small scale.
Right.
The
Let's
big
get some other
scale is
comments
liquid
around this out.
transportation fuels.
Yeah, you've been waiting to say some comments. Yep.
Hi, I'm Sheila Watson from the FIA Foundation, but my interest in this conversation is through something called the Global Fuel Economy Initiative, which is a consortium of organisations including UNEP and International Energy Agency, and we go into countries we're frankly barely interested in the OECD, except I think, as someone said, as perhaps a sort of thought leader and an exemplar. If you look at cars, and that's what we look at, the global fleet will triple before 2050, and 80 to 90% of that will not be in the OECD. It will be in the countries that Feng's working in, but many others too. So what we do, and going to your point about how do you mobilise, is you look at everyone with a role to play. So consumers are vastly important. You stole the line a moment ago. So consumer information, all of those sorts of things. Regulation, the dreaded R word. I was delighted to hear someone say that. Vitally important. You look in countries that regulate on fuel standards and their fuel economy improves. So it's a suite of measures, and what we do is go into countries and help them charitably, we're not consultants, to understand that it's a fleet of measures and a range of measures across all of those things, from information to regulation to engagement with local producers.
Yeah, and what we also know is
that's going to that's going to halve.
But what we also know is, in front of all of the people in this room, a very difficult question of how they spend their time. How much time should the people in these companies spend on regulation versus the breaks or the benchmarks, right? Where does the policy, right? Because the time is an important piece, yes.
So, I mean, while we berate companies for short-termism and quarterly thinking, I mean, companies really make, most energy stuff is longer-term investment. Even if it's just a couple of years, it's longer term than the quarter. Mm-hmm. But the trouble is we have a policy environment which is very short-term and it's very hard to predict. I used to run a fairly large solar company in Australia, and it was a $20 million solar company, and the government program it was dependent on was cancelled at 24 hours notice. Right? That's the kind of thing that happens when you have a short-term policy. Right. Australia still doesn't have a real price on carbon that any business can rely on, because we had one government had a tax trading scheme, the next one, then it was replaced by a carbon tax, then it was replaced by a trading scheme, and of course now we've got a government that doesn't want any price at all. UK still doesn't have a price on carbon. It has a league table. Next term it will have a price. Who knows? While we're arguing about how we should do it, companies can't move forward. Right? But Germany, of course, is the classic counterexample, where it had a rebate on solar which was predicted over multiple years, multiple governments, everybody in the industry knew.
So how much time do you spend working on policy and lobbying in government?
Depends whether you live in a democracy or a place where governments buy politicians, and I'm not.
Right, I'm just interested in the consequence of the comment, right, is how much time as business leaders should we spend changing policy?
It's hard. I testified to the Senate on the issue, but you can't spend all your time lobbying if you're going to run a business.
Comment here, we haven't, yeah.
Good morning, everybody. I've spent a career trying to impact policy in Washington, particularly on renewable energy, sustainable energy. And you know what? Washington's a mess. In my view, hey, headline, right? In my view, the way you have got to address this is you have got to empower the consumer, the person. You've got these buzzwords, transparency, sustainability, responsibility, but 43% of the world's population is, quote, youth. And what do these youth have in large part? They all have a mobile phone, right? So if we can put together a system to communicate with these people, these young people, right, this is how we will have an impact on policy. The solution has got to be market-driven because policy follows the dollars. That's just the reality of life. But we worked with the Social Good Conference on Sunday, and we launched a program. We had Will.i.am, we had Dick Gephardt, we had the former guy who ran global entertainment for Apple. And we had a 25-year-old graduate from Harvard who invented this thing called a socket ball, right? You kick this ball for a little bit, and you pull this thing out, you put it in, and it's a light. And light's big to a lot of people. Now, what's the importance of this? What it is a way to build relevance with young people. And through building relevance, and then if you can show them that they can have an impact, you can start to change the policy. Thank you.
Right. So one of the implications that we all should change our job, right, and now go into youth and communications and policy, right? But the real implication is sort of what are we going to do differently to spend our time, whether it's different language, different policy work, different government work. I mean, the implications are real and in this room. So we want to wrap up in a second. First thing, we have a tradition of hearing from a commitment of someone who's working in this space. Then I'd ask each of our speakers to give a final thought. So.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm Siobhan Kenny. I'm the Executive Director of the Applied Materials Foundation. And in India, approximately 30% of the population doesn't have access to a dependable source of electricity. And while solar power can be an exciting solution, obviously there are a number of barriers that exist in impoverished communities. So Applied Materials is going to be working with CELCO and with the Small Scale Sustainable Development Infrastructure Fund, or S3 IDF, in our commitment to electrify villages and schools in India. Specifically, the two organizations will be working to develop some flexible and creative financing for consumers that is relevant to their position as being low-income consumers. They will also be working to develop the confidence of those consumers by guaranteeing that the solar products receive financing and servicing where they're installed, which is very important to them. We're on track this year to install about 1,100 households with electricity and also 10 schools where we'll be providing not only solar power but also equipment for education in those schools. In addition, this year we've built in a strong, much more robust assessment and measurement component to the commitment, which we hope will actually give us better information and a greater understanding of the true impact of how people's lives are improved through access to this clean energy.
Great. Thank you. Who cares to start? Great. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. It was a great pleasure being here. I think the key takeaway for me is that technology remains one of the key enablers for a transition to low carbon society, but it's not it. What it really takes is leadership and getting organized ourselves and empowering the consumer to make the transition.
Great. Thanks. Faith?
And I appreciate everyone's comments. I really am inspired by a lot of what people are doing here today, and I heard some great comments in terms of what our opportunities still are. When I look at it, it really resonated with me that it is. I talked a lot about the financial model, but it is actually, we do link the strategy to growth. And I do believe at the end of the day, the new business models that we're developing through sustainability, using innovation and collaboration, is the growth strategy for the future. And I just really want to just throw that challenge out there that that is what the new economy is going to be about.
Yeah, I think both the policy and technologies are important. I think the interdisplay between technology and policy are important. I think we are at the tipping point of energy revolution. I think renewable energy coupled with distributing the power, I think that's going to be a future direction. I think I'm very hopeful for the future of a new energy revolution.
Great. And thank you all for the conversation. Thanks for giving us progress and things to be optimistic about. We hope out of this conversation you have some other ideas, either about strategy, how you talk about the work, the examples. Thank you very much.